All
Got
right.
it.
So it is my great pleasure to have Barry Cook for talking with us. Uh, Barry is my PhD advisor, and I just recently realized that it's almost the 20th year anniversary of
That's
my
right.
defense.
That's
So,
right.
like in a few months, it will be 20 years from when I defended my PhD. So Barry has been a monumental figure in my academic life, friend, mentor, teacher. So I'll give a little bit of a background, probably forgetting tons of stuff because Barry has done a lot of things. But yeah, he received his bachelor's in music NEC from the University of Missouri in the middle of the 80s. And then in the beginning of the 90s, he received his PhD from CARMA, the well-known Center for Computer Music Research, Computer Music Research and Acoustics, Stanford. Then joined Princeton University, where he was my PhD advisor, and was there for many years, then became
14.
professor, 15, yeah.
Yeah.
Professor emeritus, which he still is. He's active consulting, performing, lecturing, teaching, and generally making sound in various interesting ways. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, an ACM Fellow, written a bunch of books, a lot of influential articles. And probably most important, I think some of the most interesting creative people that I know are former students of Perry. So it's a select group of people. So it's my great pleasure to have Perry here talking about synthesizers.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start. So do you recall when was the first time you heard a synthesizer?
I've been thinking about that. I'm sure it was the 60s. That was when everybody first heard a synthesizer, I think. Although BB and Louis Barron did the score for Forbidden Planet.
Right.
And they actually soldered a different circuit for each character. So there was a circuit for the robot that made sound, and you
Oh,
could modify.
cool.
So there were custom, bespoke, purpose-built synthesizers, one for each motif in the movie, and that was in the 50s. And so,
Right.
so that predate that movie came out the year before I was born, and
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
I'm pretty sure I saw that movie when I was, 11, 12, 15 years old, because it was always rolling with, other stuff that on TV. And then certainly switched on Bach, that
Mm-hmm.
era in the 60s. Synthesizers started appearing in commercials, the sounds, the bleeps and bloops, and the popcorn song, and all those other things that were some of the early Zenith and Coca-Cola hired synthesists to make weird little motifs for them so that they could
Right.
and composers started using. So it would be the 60s. It could be the early 60s if you count my mom's electronic organ, which
Right.
in a way it's like a
Yeah, yeah.
circuit which
Oh, absolutely.
synthesizes waveforms which you can modify by changing shit. And so I think that it wasn't strictly a true synthesizer geek would say that's not a synthesizer, but
Yeah.
come on. So
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't really think of that legacy of commercials and movies, like
yeah, yeah.
sort of almost predates the use of them in kind of the rock bands and
Oh
the
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That first started, in a I think it really started infiltrating itself into commercial work in
Mhm.
little pieces, because they're short. You could then the
Yeah,
cost per second was worth it. Uh,
right.
where and then when I first started at UMKC, University of Missouri, in 1973, which is when I first started at conservatory. Within that first year, I got a job in the recording studio there, which had a dual Moog Mark IV wall of synthesizer. And I had a job helping to maintain that, soldering patch cords, aligning it, doing stuff, and recording student concerts. And so we had a whole staff of people that, since it was a conservatory, so that's where I cut my teeth doing location recording and live sound and all that stuff throughout that. And so within a couple of years after I was working in that studio, I bought that mini Moog that's behind
Oh,
me
wow. Okay.
over my shoulder. So that's the last year that the mini Moog was made commercially by Norland Music, which had bought Moog
Right.
from Bob Moog. And so that's the last of that era.
Wow.
And so that basically is the little brother pre-patched of the Moog Mark IV. It's got the same oscillators, has the same ladder filter in it, and all that sort of stuff. And so so I was off and running with a couple of 2-track recorders, a 4-track tape recorder, and then eventually an 8-track tape recorder, and that mini Moog and a bunch of other stuff in the 70s, I would say. And so that sort of takes it from where I first heard a synthesizer to where I first owned a synthesizer.
Got your hands on one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. So I guess the next topic I would like to chat a little bit about is we have talked about the incredible influence that Max Mathews had and kind of his pioneering work. It's hard to wrap our modern brains around, having to use two different computers physically separated in space to create a few seconds of digital audio.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sort of the concept of a computer music language, the unit generator, the patching, all of that is still with us and arguably kind of changed music completely. So I sort of, through the years, I've heard several Max Mathews stories from you, and I actually met, I think, twice while kind of hanging out at Karma with Max, who was pretty old at the time, but very nice fellow. So just any thoughts, stories, whatever, memories.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, Max was this force of enthusiastic, happy force of nature that convinced Bell Labs that it was worth letting him do music. That was back when Bell Labs was a monopoly, and they were the phone company, and they were always interested in the quality of audio, although phone calls weren't that high quality, but they were interested in coding, computational acoustics. Manfred Schroeder, a lot of people, the guy who sort of invented the reverberator that we all use today pretty commonly. And so Max was I was just fortunate that in my time at Karma, Max retired from Bell Labs, and he and Marge loaded everything. They got the smallest U-Haul trailer, and they said whatever they could fit from their house into that U-Haul was all they were going to take with them. And so they had to really prioritize what they were bringing. Now, given that, Bell Labs packed up all of Max's lab and shipped it to Karma. So he didn't have to bring his work life in that U-Haul trailer. And so his lab showed up at Karma with him, and he started working there. And he was working on refinements of the radio baton, which he had already invented, but they were doing the radio version. The first baton was actually strain gauges on a piece of wood that you hit with an actual felt mallet, and the pattern on the 4 strain gauges would tell you where it got hit and how hard. And so he was working on the radio version when he first came to Karma. He was also he was still, I think, in contact with Laurie Anderson, working on fiddle stuff with her.
Right. Yeah.
And he, would still, he would sit there every morning. He'd come in, have his coffee and his computer, mostly worked in a terminal with a green font,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I still do today sometimes when I'm programming, just to kind of feel what it was like to
Yeah.
work in a font like that and a color like that. And he was working on code for the radio baton. I worked with him later at Interval Research on scan synthesis, which
Right.
you all are probably going to talk about in class just a little bit.
Yep.
And on other projects with him at Interval and on other projects, he and I actually never wrote a paper together on any topic.
Right.
Um, we taught the psychoacoustics course together, so I edited the book with his chapters in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and we were also fortunate that right after Max retired and came to Stanford, John Pierce retired from Bell Labs and
And
came to
to
Stanford.
Stanford.
So we
Yeah.
had essentially the grandfather and father of computer music
Yeah.
from Bell Labs in-house, interested in writing, teaching, doing all that sort of stuff. And so I think that the things I remember most about Max are he would always fix something rather than buy a new one. So a lot of his things were screwed and bolted together and glued and repaired. Um, he would purpose build a device for his life. And so he carried his pens. He made a belt, a thing that fit on his belt that was made out of two brass tubes. And that way when he bent over, they didn't stab him in the chest.
Oh,
and
I see.
they wouldn't fall out of his pocket. They clipped into these brass tubes, and he could always reach down. It was like a gun holster, he could reach down and get a pen or a pencil
Yeah.
immediately out of this thing. And he soldered those brass tubes together and made a clip that fit on his belt. He would rubber band his glasses to his head,
I remember that. Yeah.
such that there was a permanent deep indentation
Yes.
in the skin in the back of his head.
Yeah.
But his glasses never fell off, and they never fell
Right.
down, and they never and he didn't lose them on his head. When he put them on his head, he knew that rubber band was there holding them,
Yeah.
and it was loose enough he could put them around his neck. And so anyway, his attention to purposely building a little thing to make his life more reliable and dependable and predictable, so that he wouldn't lose a tool. That's another thing. His shop was immaculately organized.
Right.
Every drawer had a label, and that's what was in there. And so that also is something I aspire to, but don't quite achieve. But recently, in the last year and a half, I've paid a little attention to making my shop a little bit more organized. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's an ongoing.
What do you mean? The sound lab
chase.
was so organized.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, whenever Bear would clean the sound lab, he would just open the floor and throw everything under there, and then close the floor back up. And so that's
Right.
Yeah.
So did Max came to Karma before you
No.
were there or while you were there?
He came, I think, the year or the year after that I came. So I
Okay.
went there in '86, and I
Right.
think Max retired in '86 and came to
Right.
Stanford over that next year. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was recently, I've been looking a little bit more at Hugh LeCain. It's kind of fascinating because the National Research Council of Canada, where he worked on he was doing measuring for physics experiments, like was building these devices,
Yep.
and did the synthesizer stuff as a hobby.
Yeah.
And at some point in the 50s, they actually said, go ahead, this is going to be your full-time job. And they had enough I guess flexibility and not pressure to commercialize things that they could do something like that, which is similar to sort of Max getting
Very similar. Yep.
the license to do something which at the time was completely exotic. Like it's very hard for us to go to that. Cool. So
Yeah.
let's move a bit forward in time.
I have to add
Oh,
one
one
more
more.
thing.
Yeah.
The number of people who passed through Max's lab at Bell Labs, including Laurie Anderson and Jean-Claude Rousset and Dexter Morrill, and all the people who came through as visitors and who would do a residency or a
Right.
research, it was remarkable as well. So it wasn't
Oh,
just
yeah.
like making him a fellow and letting him kind of, do whatever he was doing. They actually funded artists and researchers to come
Yeah.
and work in his group with he and John Pierce and others. And so that was another contribution that I think a lot of people don't even realize
Hmm.
that it wasn't just he invented computer music, then we all picked it up and went off with it. But
Right.
but there was also his influence. He was sort of a advisor to a lot of people as well
Oh,
at
yeah.
that time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I
And
remember.
he showed you were talking about how we can't even imagine how you have to use two computers, and like Princeton, they used to have to drive a
Yeah.
computer tape to a different place, use it to generate a tape which had digital data on it, which they would drive up to Bell Labs and put
Yeah.
on the Bell Labs computer and put it in memory so they could use the DACs.
Right.
There were only a couple of digital analog converters for
I know.
audio
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
And Max showed other people how to build those. And so Andy Moore built a 14-bit DAC that based on partly on Max's plans that he showed him how to build.
Yeah.
And then Dexter Morrow got DACs, and then Earcom, of course, got DACs, and other people got DACs. But that was basically Max showing people how to
How
do
to
the
do it.
hardware for computer
Right.
music as well, which we
Yeah.
all take
No.
for granted. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and
Mm.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, so then we go into kind of the era of the 80s and the importance of FM synthesis. And kind of, I would say that was sort of such an interesting story because there is essentially John Chowning being a composer of experimental computer or academic computer music,
Mhm.
somehow, the story better than I do, but deciding to license FM, and then Yamaha picking it up, and then suddenly this thing exploding and becoming
Mhm.
the sort of sounds behind so much music of the 80s. So
Yeah.
let's go over that story a little bit.
So first we have to start with the fact that John was just trying to make a waveform with a vibrato. And he accidentally mistyped the frequency of the vibrato. So he was trying to do a 10 hertz vibrato, which is a fast vibrato.
Right.
If a singer has a vibrato that fast, we call them nervous. But he was trying to make a sound with 10 hertz vibrato, and he accidentally typed in 100.
Right. So
And when
he was using an LFO
yes,
and
yeah,
was mistyped the
mistyped the frequency,
right.
and out came this complex sound that
Yeah.
he was surprised by. And then eventually, I don't know over what period of time, it occurred to him that, for the price of a couple of waveforms, he had gotten many, many, many harmonics. And
Right.
so, and it was, and since he had an envelope on that LFO, he heard a spectral evolution that was also remarkable.
Yeah.
And so from that accident, he went around and started talking to people about what that was, and he went to people in engineering to talk about frequency modulation and all that sort of stuff. And of course, nobody in engineering really knew about frequency modulation that was where both waveforms are in the audio band.
Right.
Almost everyone in engineering is in communications, and they're talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
hertz, thousands of hertz modulating tens of thousands of hertz, kilohertz
Right.
for AM, or millions of hertz for FM. And so that's what we think of for FM. He said, I want to talk to you about FM. The engineer said, okay, you put a camera, stick it through your radio tower, modulate it with your audio. It gives you sidebands. You then heterodyne that back down to the passband,
Right.
and you'll hear your audio again. And so, but it took them a minute thinking about the math, I think, with him to think
Yeah.
of what was going on. You know, it wasn't a megahertz with all these sidebands. It was audio band with all these sidebands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which are more audio band. And
Right.
so it's getting this complex waveform. In their case, initially for the price of 2 sine waves, you
Yeah.
can have thousands of sine waves.
Right.
And the economy of that,
Yeah.
and combined with that spectral evolution, the
Yeah.
possibility of by turning up the index of modulation, you get more spectral richness.
Mhm.
And the property that if they're harmonically related, you get a harmonic sound. If they're inharmonically related, you get an
Yeah.
inharmonic sound, all for the cost of 2 sine waves. So you now have this whole flexible thing where just moving these 2 characters around with envelopes, you get you get lots of things for that computation. And the story about licensing it to Yamaha, you should get from Channing, who's
Yeah.
still around. But
I'll
he
treat.
shot. They shopped it. They took it to OTL. I don't know if OTL exactly existed in that way at the time. I think so. There was a Office of Technology and Licensing at Stanford. Well,
Right.
Stanford had prior to that a really lucrative patent in the medical field
Right.
for some kind of a rat DNA modification or something that they licensed and made a lot of money from. So from that, they had set up this idea that we should enable technology transfer from within the university and possibly fund patent applications. And so he took it to them. I don't know on whose recommendation. I don't know if it was one of the engineers or if it was his idea or what. But they shopped it to all the organ manufacturers, Rogers
Right.
Organ, Hammond Organ, all those manufacturers of the era. They were all still dealing almost exclusively in the analog domain. None of
Correct.
them
Yeah.
had gone digital yet.
Yeah.
And so they sort of said, well, it's, no, thank you. And so basically they shopped it to Yamaha, and Yamaha said, yeah, we're interested, but it's going to take quite a bit of development, so we want an exclusive. And they got
Right.
an exclusive, which by the end of the life of the initial patent, Yamaha patent, sorry, Stanford FM patent, which was licensed by Yamaha,
Right.
there was a lot of consternation on the part of music manufacturers and sound card manufacturers and
Yeah.
game manufacturers
Oh, yeah.
as to how much Yamaha was charging for those chips that
Yeah.
did FM.
Of
And
course.
they
Yeah.
were quite angry that Stanford would have exclusively licensed this to one Japanese company. But the
Yeah.
real story is nobody else wanted it in the
Yep.
music space, and we weren't quite digital yet. We
Right.
weren't quite to the point where they could really take advantage of the precision you need
Yeah.
in the sine wave generation in order to use FM
Yeah.
effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you remember or recall, like, from the licensing to the selling of the DX7, how many years did it take?
There were a couple of things that came out before it. There was a big kind of boat anchor giant thing called the G something that they came out
Right.
with that was really kind of like that, the Synclavier or one of those things that
Yeah. Super
nobody
expensive.
would
Yeah.
nobody would really own, sort of, except maybe
Right.
a rich guy with a recording studio or something like that. And till the DX7 came out, I think it was approaching 7 years,
Okay.
8
Yeah.
years, something like that. And
Right.
so I believe, let's see, 76 to 90. I think the FM patent, you should check it, but I think it issued in 76.
Okay.
And I think the DX7 came out in 83.
85, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so that machine before it came out maybe in 83 or 84. So really we can think it was probably a decade from when
okay,
John discovered it to
right.
where they were patenting it and shopping it around to
Yeah.
where Yamaha licensed it maybe a couple of years into 1 year into the process, and then they developed it for 8 years or so before they really had
Mhm.
something to do. And so yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so let's maybe that can lead to so FM had the advantage that you could control it a little bit more than sampling and kind of traditional oscillator-based stuff
Uh-huh.
that was relatively hard to control, but still there's some limitations, and some of those are dealt with physical modeling synthesis. So, and you have obviously done a lot of work in physical modeling synthesis, but when did you first encounter the concept, or was it even
Um,
called that back then?
yes, yeah, it was. Yeah, at that would be at Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that would be at Stanford. I was Julius's advisee.
Right.
Um, I looked at his code. I started with his paper that has the clarinet in
Okay.
it. Basically, I started with that paper with his hand-drawn clarinet figure that was, famous at that time. That was how he generated papers, and
Yeah.
which I think was an ICMC paper. And I coded that up on the Samson box, which was our big hardware synthesizer there, and got that running. And so that would have been 1980, end of 1986, when I was
Right.
first exposed to the idea of physical modeling.
So
He
Julius probably worked on the string stuff before that, right? Or
he
no?
worked on actually, I don't know. He ended up doing the string stuff for his thesis,
Yes.
but maybe I have his order wrong, because my order was I really discovered the clarinet first.
First, yeah.
Um, it's a simple model. It's one delay line and a nonlinearity,
Right.
and a filter if you want it. Um, the string stuff is one delay
Yeah.
line and a
Two,
nonlinearity, but you have to put the nonlinearity in two places. So it's really
yes.
two delay lines and a
And two, yeah.
nonlinearity. And and so in a way it's a little bit more complicated model, and the dynamics of controlling it, I think, are more complicated. And wave equation's the same. The other thing I guess maybe it wasn't called physical modeling synthesis. It was called waveguide synthesis. When I
Right.
first
Yeah.
heard of it, a delay line, two delay lines are a waveguide,
Right.
and if you use that for synthesis, then there you are. So that I think that definitely was the first I ever heard of computer-based physical modeling.
Yes.
There were lots of synthesizers that were mechanical.
Yeah.
Von Kempelen's speaking machine, which I
Yeah.
was aware of somewhat from the old days, and people who made objects that appeared to make sound. And I was deeply into the idea of controllers controlling synthesizers pretty early on, even way back in UMKC. So the
Right.
Lyricon, which was this thing you could plug into a Moog and would
Right.
actually control that. But nothing of that is physical modeling. And then physical modeling, you can get in debates over
Yeah.
how modal synthesis is certainly has roots in physics. It doesn't
Yeah.
solve the wave equation, but actually it does,
Yeah.
because a sum of superposed sine waves in a space with boundaries does solve the wave equation. Therefore, it's a solution to that
Yeah.
differential equation. And so it is blind modal synthesis, where you don't know the structure of the object and you're just looking at the harmonics,
Yeah.
or I'm sorry, at the partials,
Yeah.
is spectral synthesis. And so and so really it was kind of cool when I was working on my thesis. Xavier Serra was working on his thesis, and he was
Right.
doing spectral modeling and I was doing physical modeling, and we would, discuss back and forth
Yes.
which goes where. And so
Nice. So you overlapped with when Xavier was at Karma, I guess.
yep. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think he was the TA when I took Julius's class, basically.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about singing voice synthesis, your PhD, and
Mhm.
other developments in that area. So
Yeah, so I had done the clarinet, and I did the meta wind instrument, which is a clarinet, a flute, and a trombone. It has a reed, which is either a lip or a reed or a jet. And I had published papers on that and built controllers for that, and had worked with Dexter Morrow and doing the trumpet controller. And so I was doing a lot of brassy, windy things. And when it came time to really work on my thesis, I basically presented to Julius and John. I said, I'm really interested in cymbals, percussion cymbals. And I think that's something nobody's done, and it's, pretty gnarly, and it's interesting, and, it gets into that whole class of metal objects that are really nonlinear, and conceived possibly. And John said, you're a singer, you're not a drummer. Why don't you do the voice? And I had done, while I was doing I did the first clarinet toots on the Samson box, and then I moved everything over to a Lisp machine, a Dandelion or a Dandy Tiger or something, and was trying to work in there. But then we had some Mathews, and Steve Pope introduced us to Smalltalk, which is the first object-oriented language that was even the language and the environment and the GUI and everything is written as objects. And so you could define arbitrary things in the operating system as maybe, and they would just either work or not. Or you could give the fonts gravity.
Yeah.
And they would all suck together on the screen. And so anyway, I thought it was just really cool. And so I ported everything over to Smalltalk and started working there. And I built a clarinet that had a vocal track tube that you could modify.
Okay.
And so basically
you change the resonances kind of.
You could change the shape. It wasn't just a delay line. It was that series of acoustic tubes, that Kelly Lochbaum model that Max had done with John Kelly and Carol Lochbaum in the early 60s at Bell Labs. And so that's the Daisy song. When you hear the Daisy song from Bell Labs, that is an acoustic tube model of the vocal tract. It actually models it as a set of concatenated tubes of different diameters. I built a clarinet that had that in Smalltalk, and when I moved it, it didn't sound like a voice because it was being driven by a reed. And so what it did was it did this horrific goose-like yodeling. It would go like that. And so as I was changing the resonances, of course, the reed was trying to find the closest resonance. It's as if you were playing your sax and someone, not you, was like arbitrarily closing and opening holes.
Right.
And you don't know what's going to really happen, but the reed has to go somewhere, and it'll go to some nearby resonance. And so that was kind of cool. And then I actually replaced the reed with a little oscillator, a vocal fold oscillator. And I did the first, I know I did ya, ya, ya. That was the first sound that I did in Smalltalk that sounded like a female singer singing a little vocal exercise. And Channing had heard that. And so he discouraged me from doing cymbals.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And he said, what do you think, Max? He literally called Max in and said, what do you think? Max said, you know what? No one's ever been able to do female voices. All the good speech synthesizers sound like male voices. And even Dennis Klatt's Klatt speech deck talk synthesizer, Perfect Paul sounds better than Beautiful Betty.
Right.
And because you can't do the analysis performance on female voices as well, because your sampling of the spectrum is sparser because the harmonics are farther apart.
Right.
So when a female speaks in a higher range or sings in a higher range, your sampling of the actual spectral envelope is so sparse that you don't know where those formants are. And so that's why the formant synthesizers, even the ones from Stockholm, Johan Sundberg's synthesizer, didn't sound that good. And Max said, we haven't done females well, and yours sounds like a good female singing. So you should do female singing as your thesis. And at the time, right at that instant, I got my first Next machine, serial number 40.
So that's Sheila was born. Yes.
Yep. And so I got my Next machine, serial number 40, and in the DSP, I could run an 8-segment vocal tract at 22 kilohertz in real time.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's what set the physiology and the sample rate of Sheila. Is her neck couldn't be any longer because I didn't have the cycles to actually do the computation for the ladder filter in there. And so that's how that was all basically born. So that's why Sheila sounds the way she does.
Right.
And I think I did an 8-segment one as well. I had just picked 8 at 22 kilohertz, sort of randomly based on the length of a female larynx in small talk. And so that one sort of sounds like Sheila too.
Right.
Now, that's
that
really
probably high for that time period. Like most people who did work were using lower sampling rates.
For speech, for sure. Nobody ever worked higher. People would do for speech recognition, the highest they'd ever do was 16K.
Yeah.
And for speech synthesis,
Usually
16 and 8 was standard because that was the phone company.
Yeah.
8K gives you 4K of bandwidth. Everybody's phone line had 4K of bandwidth.
Right.
Nobody cared about a digital subscriber line at that time. An ISDN consisted of 64 kilobit channels. 64 kilobits per second divided by 8 bits is 8 kilohertz sample rate. Exactly. And that's what an ISDN line was for voice. ISDN consisted of 2 B channels and an A channel, which was 2 64 kilobits and 128 kilobit. And I think the 128 kilobits interesting from an MP3 standpoint, because everybody kind of got stuck there that yes, you can transmit high quality coded music over a line like that. Yeah. And so basically we're all kind of stuck with that legacy of 8K or some multiple. There were some people doing synthesis. Paul Lansky and Ken with LPC used to work at 14K. And I don't know why. I don't know why. It just fit something, probably, that's how long it took overnight to compute something, probably. I don't really know. But to do LPC analysis at a much higher sample rate is stupid because it spends too much time trying to match features in that higher part of the spectrum,
which is quite random,
which is pretty random and subject to all sorts of weirdness, and we're not as tuned into it for speech intelligibility. We are for quality, but for speech intelligibility, we don't really care that much about that step up at 18K and things like that. And so that's how I got to work on the voice physical modeling. And later, Scott Van Dyne came along and did the symbol really well. He did a waveguide mesh with a couple of peppered nonlinear filters, which are really, really wonderful sounding cymbal-like sounds. And so, but that would have been another 7 years, I think,
Right.
after I made my decision to not do that. So,
Right.
at
Yeah.
John's urging.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I never knew the cymbal
Yeah,
direction kind of.
yeah, exactly.
So going into percussion, one of my favorite papers, and actually that came about, I think it was around the time I was a grad student, was the maraca simulation, and kind of going from a detailed physical simulation of a particle system where you would model all the collisions to kind of the statistical approach to it. So yeah, let's talk about that, or give us the
Yeah,
story.
so you are correct. When I went from Stanford to Princeton, I decided to do some new things. I decided one to well, I decided to do a lot of things. I decided to work on percussion, on statistical, or not on statistical, particle percussion. So I was going back and saying, okay, I'm still working on the voice, keeping Sheila alive and making additions to her, but I'm sort of done with that. I had done a whole bunch of physical modeling synthesis for companies. For media vision, we built a chip that could do waveguide modeling. It could do 256 delay lines, interpolated delay lines, as a DSP chip, and attached to a CMOS memory, and so you had lots of memory for delay. And so I built them clarinets, and we built a big kind of exhausted piano with a shared soundboard and a whole bunch of things like that. And but in going for research wise, I looked at Princeton and said, what does their CS department do? And they were pretty famous for graphics.
Yeah.
Michael Cohen had been there,
Right.
and Dobkin and all the other people, but kind of SIGGRAPH style graphics. And I thought, well, let's do some 3D modeling. Let's build some 3D models. And so I built some BBs and bounced them around in a maraca, and assume a spherical maraca, assume spherical balls inside, bounce them around, bash them into each other, assume each particle, when it hits the shell, makes a sound which corresponds to the shell sound, basically the impulse response of the shell. The velocity at which it hits the normal component of that, not the tangential component, is how much it should excite it. So if it just grazes off of it tangentially, it doesn't make any sound. There's no sound inside. The BBs hitting each other we don't care about in terms of a maraca. And so I did some simulations and ran those. And I knew that Princeton had all of these room full of SGIs and all these graphics computers, and I'd be able to do that stuff. But in the interim, I just ran it on my laptop, and I would run it and made a few animations of the BBs bouncing around and doing things. And at some point, it occurred to me that, it was going to be interesting to do, the n squared problem of particle-particle collisions, and the n problem of particle shell collisions. That was, of course, not going to scale, when you go to, and it's going to scale is n squared. And it just occurred to me to collect statistics. So I did a run where I just said, what is the likelihood that a BB at any time is going to bang into the shell?
Right.
And what is the average energy that it does that at? And so when I collected that data on that run, I looked at it, and it turns out the waiting time between a BB having its moment when it actually makes a sound is Poisson.
Yeah.
And so, which kind of makes sense because they're unrelated to each other. It's what you need for a Poisson process. It's
Right.
in gas and all sorts of thermodynamics and all that sort of stuff, which made sense. Everything made sense in retrospect. And so I
Yeah.
said, well, why don't I just calculate each sample in time, which could be a window. It doesn't even have to be each sample.
Yeah.
A Poisson process and say, did we make a sound or not at this instant?
Yeah.
And you're drawing from that Poisson distribution. And if we did draw from the distribution of what the energies are, which basically is just random 0 to 1, it's uniform on, but scaled by the net system energy. So as the
Right.
BBs bounce around, energy decays away, and that's of course just an exponential decay.
Yeah.
And so it is the envelope of the sound, but it's all because it's the envelope of the energy in the system.
Yeah.
And so we just draw from that exponential decay and say, and then we basically just excite a filter that corresponds to the maraca shell
Right.
with an impulse or a little burst of noise, and
Yeah.
we're off and running. And so that model scales to an infinity of BBs.
Yeah.
Your Poisson process just changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, every sample, if you're saying, should I put a little energy into my filter, that costs nothing. It's literally that same computation, every sample or every subsample.
Yeah.
And so you're off and running. So that's how I got from exhaustive physical modeling of BBs bouncing around to a much more parametric, much
Yeah.
more scalable. And then we went looking around for other things that look like that in the world. And so there are lots of things, all things particle-y
Right.
are controlled by some kind of excitation energy, be it footsteps on leaves over that period you're exciting it. But as those things bounce around, they decay away exponentially, just like everything else. And so, so that's how FISM was born. Physically inspired stochastic event modeling.
Is it inspired or informed?
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway,
What did I say it was in the paper? That's what. I will tell you, in the original paper, I misspelled maraca, though. So if you look back at the original paper,
right.
I embarrassingly misspelled maraca, but I
Which is with two C's or something?
One C, I spelled maracha.
Oh, maracha.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, it's really, yeah, I think I like that paper a lot because it's sort of, there's efficiency, there is control, you don't sacrifice control. And, it's sort of, you don't need to do the full accurate physics because it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't. Yeah. Yeah.
It's sort of, but you still can, make a maraca with fewer beads or bigger beads or different wood, or there's so much richness to
that.
And
none of that costs any computation to speak of. The computational burden is exactly the same whether you have a million beads or not. And you have control, and it's in a way there are cases like if you're rolling a maraca like this and the beans are kind of and you have two stereo microphones. I don't know how you do that. You wouldn't be able to get that level, but my description of it just gave me an idea that you could fix that pretty quick. You could use the same maraca model and just basically, trade the energy between two systems, and that's your microphones, and you could basically be off and running. And so there are certainly plenty of cases where you don't know, or you don't need to know. And so, and then I built a bunch of controllers. This was the first tambourine controller, which has no timbals at all.
Right.
I took them off and sampled them individually to see what their partials were. Right. And they were pretty random. They're just high, because the engineering in stamping out these timbals, and certainly the Zilimasa in Turkey and probably Greece, there's just, it's coins. It's
Yeah,
basically
yeah,
pieces of metal, hunks of
yeah, and they just
hunks,
hammer them.
hunks of tin can, and you just hammer them out and put them all on a nail and shake it. And
Right.
so you don't care that the individual characters have the right partials. And that's in fact why in the tambourine model, I just randomly grab a frequency.
Mm,
They're not a set of frequencies that correspond to each one of the little critters that are in here, because we don't care. And our ear
right.
doesn't care
Yeah,
because they're high enough that we're just interested in filling in the spectrum. When you shake this and the accelerometer attached puts the energy into the system. And so as I said, I went around looking for lots of other things that satisfy that constraint
right.
or that description.
So that's another thing I think that like it's a good segue to my next topic, which is kind of the what I would call escaping the keyboard in sound synthesis, which seems to be it's kind of like an airplane that we keep wanting to take off and it keeps never taking off.
That is true.
But yeah, I think the whole like NIME community and controllers and really to some extent realizing, and this is something we talked about in class, that yes, you can have a very rich expressive synthesis model, but you need to control it in order to, in interesting ways, in
Yep.
order to really leverage it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean the difference between a DX7, which got popularity because it could replace a Fender Rhodes and a B3 and weighed 1/10 of what a proper Fender Rhodes with its speakers, actually even less than that weighs, and I don't know, 50th of what a B3 with its proper speakers weighs. And it was a keyboardist's instrument, and it could do keyboards. It could do an organ, it could do an electric piano, it could do a trumpet and a trombone and a chorus of voices and all those things. But it was a real synthesizer, it was a keyboard synthesizer. And so its popularity compared to the Yamaha VL1, which was a monophonic physical modeling saxophone synthesizer that you had to play like a keyboard. So how successful is that going to be? And Korg made the Prophecy, which is exactly the same thing. Has a beautiful sax and a beautiful flute and a beautiful and a nice mini moog and a lot of other things in it. But I think it's monophonic as well. And so the most compelling VL1 performances were done on a WX7 wind controller. And so it's basically just a lot of hardware to replace a saxophone, which, from a practical standpoint, it weighs 10 times as much and costs, well, probably less than a good sax, but it's still a hard sell. And it doesn't solve a lot of problems for the working musician to speak of. It's attractive as hell to you and I and Julius and lots of other people. Another problem is that FM, a few algorithms, a few topologies.
The classic DX7 display of topologies.
A few topologies solve, one topology pretty much gets brass done. Another topology gets another topology gets
percussion kind of
electric pianos,
electric piano,
and harps and things that are like that. So the problem with physical modeling is, you have winds. Okay, one algorithm-ish thing does winds. You need a relative of it, but quite different for strings. Another relative for and none of them solve snare drums none of them saw. So, you know, it's not surprising that sampling won in a way.
Right. Yeah. Well,
You know,
and it's also like it's the resourcing, like, it was so expensive to have samples. So
Yeah.
these synthesizers went to all these tricks to avoid spending memory. And
Yep.
now you go and you can get these libraries where they have sampled every instrument of the
Yep.
Vienna Philharmonic playing,
Yep.
every single note, and it's gigabytes and gigabytes of samples.
And every week on Facebook, I get a new pitch that we're selling every sample we've ever made for
Yeah.
$50, or we're giving every sample we've ever made free if you
Yeah.
just buy this plugin from us or something.
Yeah, but
So-
interestingly enough, like a lot of people are going back to these more, sounds that are not real. Like I still remember realism when I was a grad student was kind of the holy grail. It was
Yeah.
kind of, I don't know if we have a good term, but in graphics, they have photorealistic rendering.
Yep.
We should have, I don't know, sample realistic rendering was kind of what everybody wanted. And now we have moved into an era where nobody really cares because
Yeah.
anyone can have, these sample libraries that are
Right.
crazy.
Right.
But they are getting more, they like more the sounds of an 808, which is just
Yep.
an
Yep.
attempt to create percussion with really simple means, but it's its own aesthetic and it has its own
It's
control.
got its thing. Yep. Well, and Tom Funkhauser and I used to debate at length about physical modeling for
Right.
anything.
Yeah.
And he kept saying, yeah, I remember back in the old days at Karma, I used to debate with Yamaha and Roland engineers. They
Right.
would come to our affiliates meeting, and this one guy would come every year and he'd say, I really think PCM with digital filters is all you need, right? That's the
Right.
thing, right? And I'd say, yeah, but listen, every time I blow this clarinet, it sounds a little different.
Yeah.
And he would make this face and say, but a lot of people don't want it to sound a little different each time, and nobody knows how to control it. And fine, you can do a clarinet, but you can't do, a motorcycle with the same algorithm. And he says, my PCM with digital filters can do a
Can do
motorcycle.
anything. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Sometimes they would say image-based rendering. So image-based rendering, he said that's where it's all going to go eventually. I said, no, we still model human motion, and we want characters to, do the right thing and respond correctly and stuff. And he said, yeah, but that'll all be worked out in computational space in the future. And it sort of is now.
It is, yeah.
With deep learning. I mean, we're all
I was gonna say, like,
it's like
people
basically image-based rendering, sound-based sounding, music-based musicking. It's all coming right now.
Right. Yeah. That is that's crazy. That's that is true. It's sort of this giant memorization sampling of physics. It's like you can, the classic example I mentioned in my class is you have a billiard table, you can write a nice physics engine that will do the bounces and model the forces and do the simulation. And there are pool games that do that. And it's pretty easy these days. They have nice physics engines. But with a deep neural network, you can just train it to predict where the balls are going to be given the current configuration of their balls and velocities, and it works without any knowledge of physics. It's sort of
that is correct. Yeah, it learns physics as part of the process.
It's sort of I mean, you still need to train it, so I guess you need to run the physical system. But anyway, that is so. Let's move to software, because this is a course that really we are kind of digging into software and open source and looking at different code bases. So you have, throughout kind of your career, you have done some important contributions of software that have been taken up and percolated in different ways.
That's right.
Synthesis.
ported and absorbed and
Yeah, so let's talk about the synthesis toolkit and the history. And actually, I kind of haven't followed what's the current status, and let's talk about
yeah,
that.
it's so that was another thing I did in 1996, going from Stanford to Princeton. I had published enough papers that I was getting a lot of emails as to um, I coded up the clarinet, and when I put a 400 hertz square wave into it, it doesn't sound right. And so I would, answer the email. You don't put a 400 hertz square wave. You blow into it, and it gives you a 400 hertz square wave if you've done it correctly. So they clearly didn't understand
Yeah,
how to code it up from the paper, even though the block diagram's there and everything. And I'd get questions of I coded up the flute, and no matter how I blow it, it won't make any sound. So
right.
that's cool. That's understandable. That's like I picked up a flute and I blew into it, and it won't make any sound. That makes sense. That's another problem with physical modeling is
Yeah,
you need to know how to play it or build a software agent that can. So I decided I'd done all this stuff in Smalltalk, and I had all this stuff left over, reverbs that I had written in the Algar related language that controlled the Samson box. And I had written all this code for MediaVision that was full operator FM synthesis, all in C, because I was emulating, the chip that we were building at the time. And so I had stuff in Smalltalk, I had stuff in C, I had stuff in Motorola DS56000 DSP assembly language, I had stuff in Lisp, I had stuff in all these languages, and I had decided to learn C++. So
okay.
I took the opportunity to port everything I knew how I had ever coded
Right.
into C++ and make a set of classes and demos such that you could download STK and run the demo, and the flute would make a sound, and you had functioning code to start with. And so that's where STK came from,
Right.
basically to just
So
put all that
so
together
I think
in one language.
Yeah, so this is really, it's cool. I think it also inspired me to do open source a lot of my music retrieval stuff, and that paid off, especially in the early years when I was really active maintaining the code. And it's also something that now is valued much more. So there's, sections on reproducibility and journals on reproducible research, and people ask for code or expect code, but it was not something that was common back then, for sure. It's definitely something that
was so that's number 3 thing I did in going from Stanford to Princeton is I decided everything I did from that moment I was going to give away. I was not going to file any patents at Princeton, and I didn't.
Right. Yeah.
So basically, that experiment worked well, I guess. I got tenure, which was fine, and people use STK like crazy. And you decided to do the same thing with Marcius, and Gus decided to do the same thing with Chuck, and it all worked out, even in a non-academic sense. I think we all profited from it.
Yeah. Well, and I was talking to Randy Jones, who is he did his master's here, and he has built this sound plane instrument, which is really a beautiful kind of touch controller using positive sensing. But he's mostly making these software synthesizers that people use as VST plugins that are really nice, kind of their interface is really interesting. But he was saying that, initially he spent a lot of time thinking about piracy and software protection. And he said it like the people who are going to pay you are going to pay you. And the ones that are not. And it's almost like not worth spending resources there.
Yep.
So he has also open sourced the main kind of underlying engine of code that he uses.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that's cool. That brings me to the sort of kind of we're moving into the timeline after I left Princeton, and that's the whole like
I was
shot.
actually I was actually going to take you on a quick
Oh yeah,
shot of all the weird controllers that I've built on the shelf. Maggie's up there, and
yeah.
Lisa, and
Philip Glass,
various
I see.
maracas. Philip Glass, the coffee mug, the Romaine maraca, which is a
Yeah,
romaine lettuce with a shake sensor built inside. So anyway, I forgot to do that earlier when we were talking about control. And then of course
and of course, yeah,
the chocophonic vowel harmonic, a poetry based interface, which
yeah.
is sensitive to.
Yeah, I am gonna be posting links to YouTube videos that are public with your
That's
performance of the
good.
Christmas carols.
That's
And
good.
yeah, so yeah, let's talk about Gawang and him coming to Princeton and the birth of Chuck and kind of the also the laptop ensemble kind
Yep.
of start.
Yeah, so Go came, and as you know, I sort of, we were able to pull it off where I could let my students kind of pick what they wanted to work on. We all had to slave away on, some weird task, but to earn our keep grant wise or something. But basically, we could work on things that interested us. Um, I remember you wanted to create software that could recognize Kenny G and mute it
Yep.
when it heard it on the radio, which I believe we could probably achieve that pretty easily. But and Doug came and said, "I have an idea for a new computer music language," and I thought, "Oh God,
Yet
you
another
know,
one of those.
yeah, why do we need, why do we need?" I think I say this in one of my SDK README files is, we already have C music, C sound, C monkeys, C everything. Why do we need another something? And but God was convinced, and he was especially enamored with kind of two things that he pitched me on. One was the control of time, where there aren't any real computer music languages. We have the notion of a scheduler. Max Mathews kind of invented that. Later Barry Voco, roughly the same time, came up with the idea of a scheduler that would figure out what needed to be computed when, and Roger Danberg and lots of other people. But Bell said there's no language where time is a first class citizen, where
Yep.
it actually is a data type, a
Yep.
type safe language that time is a data type, and
Right.
where you have to cast something, you have to force something to know that it's operating on time, and the programmer has to explicitly operate on time to make anything happen at all. And so that was at the notion.
Yep.
And a new notation where it looks more like a signal processing diagram.
Yep. Yep.
So instead of unit generators all being nested function calls, I call the output of this and put it in the parentheses and operate on it, and then put that in the parentheses of something else. And that would be what it would look like kind of in C,
Yeah.
unless we just stored everything in temporary variables and tried to make it look better. But Chuck actually says a sign-off goes into
Yeah.
the DAC. A
Yeah.
sound buff sampler goes into a filter, which goes into a reverb, which goes into the DAC. And so the code actually flows left to right, which looks kind of cool, until you want to make feedback loops, and then you're in the
Yeah.
same boat that everybody else is. It is explicit who computes when because of time,
Right.
unlike unlike people who don't know that in a max patch, it kind of depends on where they occur on the screen
Yeah,
as to who gets computed when.
yeah,
It has a nice flow aspect. You do know that the wire goes from one to the
yeah,
other. There's no arrows, though. It would be nice if there were arrows that could tell you who's going into who and things like that. Chuck has
yeah,
the arrow, which
yeah,
is, the very, very explicit way of saying that. Um, there's no equal sign in Chuck. So you never have that equal versus double equal problem that everyone has in C every day that they ever code,
right.
uh,
Yeah,
which is amazing. It's type safe. The other thing that he pitched me on was he wanted to include controllers. So in
yeah,
other words, a joystick would be kind of built into the language. You'd be able to open up a joystick and use it as a controller
right.
um, right away. And so basically I said, go off and do what you're going to do. And so he built the language and it was great and it was fun. And he and I did our first concert, which was on the fly coding at listening at the Sound Kitchen,
Right.
which showed that, you could in front of an audience write code that made sound and did interesting things. And people have known that, of course, the hub and a
Yeah,
lot of other people prior to that. But a language that really encourages
yeah,
uh, on the fly coding, that really
mhm,
encourages, has a virtual machine that you can chuck things into. And that, by the way, is where it comes from.
right.
Um, you're chucking things into the audio engine and it makes sound, and you can unchuck them and pull them out, and they're not making sound anymore. And so, it worked great. Everything worked good. It was mono until the laptop orchestra was born.
Right.
Um, and when we had to make it not mono anymore, we went ahead and made it multi-channel because we had 6-channel speakers. So we wanted to be able to actually control the individual channels. And so it leapt immediately from mono to mini,
Yeah,
with stereo sort of being the default. So if you just fire it up on a laptop, it defaults to however many channels the deck has, which is always 2
right.
usually. Um, and it was really nice for the laptop orchestra because we could teach in it, we could use it for pieces, um, and synchronization, network synchronization was really cool. So we experimented a lot with pieces where who's really the conductor here and what is the conductor doing? Is
Right.
the conductor really keeping time? No, let's not let the
Yeah,
conductor keep time. Let's let some, uniquely agreed upon clock for the orchestra keep the time, like a drumming circle. And the conductor is now pointing at people to have them do things,
yeah,
and so, or to change parameters. And so that was sort of, the idea was it was a weird experimental teaching, programming, composing, performing test bed to try out new ideas with what an orchestra could really be.
yeah,
Um, it's a homogeneous orchestra. It's like the Tokyo Koto Orchestra. Everyone there has the same instrument,
right.
but the instrument is redefined by the composer
Yeah,
programmer for each piece. And
yeah,
so each piece, the laptop is doing something completely different than it did for the last one. And so the form factor of the computer and the hemisphere speaker sitting next to each player is the part that stays the same, but everything else is different from.
yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I always, I kind of almost regret that I missed a bit of that phase and left and was, starting my career at UVic. And it was also at the time music information retrieval was taking off
Yep.
really in a steep way and commercial adoption. And There was the iTunes and Spotify birth and all that. So I kind of, it was always like, oh, I really want to do some more of that stuff and play
Yeah.
more with it. And,
Yeah.
you know, I blinked a little bit and now 20 years later, but it's still, it's very cool. And I also think one thing that I find interesting, and I don't know if that's generalizable, but many of these live coding performances and laptop ensembles end up using relatively simple synthesis algorithms individually. And it's just that it's the combination, the control, the interaction that results in very interesting soundscapes rather than
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
synthesis
And
algorithm itself.
the scale of having a lot of players
Yes,
and a lot of speakers on stage
right.
is kind of undeniable. I mean, you can do little sign peeps,
Yeah,
but when you spread it out in space
yeah.
and have a lot of it, it really turns into something that you don't get otherwise.
Yeah, it's kind of like in, orchestration where
Yeah, yeah,
you can't have all instruments playing lots of stuff. It sounds crap. Like you would
right,
look at a
right,
line of a particular instrument and it might be playing a long whole note or
right,
some simple
right.
line, but in the context, it creates interesting sounds and
The
effects.
notion of looking at the stage and saying, there's no way they need that many violins,
Right.
but you wouldn't get that sound
Yeah.
if you didn't,
Yeah.
and it's sort of, there's something about that, having a herd of, it's like
Yeah.
a choir. You need 40 voices to
Yeah.
really make a choir, and they're all the same, but they do very different things. And so, and the laptop orchestra is, yeah, it's sort of weird. I'm a little surprised that the laptop orchestra is still growing as successfully as it is,
Right.
because I would not have thought, our first question we asked, I think, either in one of our papers that are in the CMJ, but definitely at that, there was a symposium that the American Composers Orchestra sort of had about the future of the orchestra.
Yeah.
And someone is it the laptop? And we asked, no, because the laptop doesn't have a future either. Eventually
Yeah.
we're not all going to have laptops. And so I'm kind of surprised we all still have laptops and we all still work on them so much.
Yeah.
That they're still around after, however many years, 30 now.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's like, it's quite surprising that, 40 maybe. When were laptops? Max, you say, yeah, he had a little laptop. He had an Osborne when he first came, as sort of this lunchbox that had
Yeah. I mean,
that lid that
but
came
like
off.
for laptop ensembles, probably I would say it's around 20, 25 years.
Yeah, 20, 25 years for laptop ensembles. I was just thinking of laptops in general.
Oh, laptops in general. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And it
that,
depends on the definition of laptop. Like I remember Miller Packet having a desktop where he had attached a handle
that's
that
correct.
would take to like different
Yeah,
conferences.
Go would regularly go into Denny's with a tower and a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse and
Yeah,
sit on a dish on a table there and eat pancakes and program. And
yeah,
so, at that point, it was basically a laptop. It just, you needed
yeah.
more
No,
computing power.
I thought I had the highest free food to research
Yeah,
ratio, but GA is a whole other level.
that's a whole different, yeah, exactly.
It's yeah, you can get a lot of interesting work done with the right amount of food intake.
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all in terms of questions I have.
Cool. Good.
I thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And
I'm always interested in helping out.
yeah,
This will be interesting. I think this makes me think this made me think this morning we should interview more people and put it all on YouTube.
Yeah, it is.
In a way, you
It's
know?
true, and it's sort of, especially, time goes by and some of
Yeah.
these people are getting old, and it's
Yeah, my Guggenheim grant, I said I was going to interview a lot of people, and I did. I interviewed Chowning, I interviewed Javier Rodet, and I interviewed Jean-Claude Rousset, and I interviewed Dexter Morrill, and I never did anything with them, and they're just on tape.
right.
So basically, if nothing, I should just pay somebody to transcribe those and put them somewhere in a
Yeah, it will.
repository.
And now I mean, with Zoom and stuff, it's easier to
Yeah.
do. You can
Yeah.
get separate, like you get separate audio for each speaker, so it's easier to edit, and
Yep. Yep.
you can get the transcript. And with the same source, you could probably, I'm trying to figure that out, but
Yeah.
put a video up and have
The
a slide
how-
thing and have a
CalArts uses this Panopto video for video hosting, for
Right.
like Canvas uses it and other places, and Panopto automatically subtitles everything
Yep.
for free. It basically just it's wrong in a lot of cases.
Right. Yeah. But it's
But
still,
it automatically takes most of the work out of subtitles.
yeah,
So,
I think I found this documentary about, I think, some early synth, maybe the Roland D50 or something, where it was the Japanese engineers, and it was in Japanese, but it had subtitles on YouTube that you could use. So that was pretty neat.
yeah. Red Bull has a pretty good history of synths page.
Yes, I have that.
With interviews with
Yeah.
Bob Moog and Don Buchla, and
Yeah,
it's got some pretty good.
I've linked to that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I found that a year ago or so. I was kind of surprised.
Yeah, there's so much stuff. It's pretty crazy. Lots of YouTube stuff and lots of historical. The thing I'm trying to do with the course that's a little bit different is to focus more on the software implementation side of things and kind of more the computer science side of things. But yeah, there's a lot to dig and a lot to discover.
Cool.
All right.
All right. Well, let me know if you
so much.
want any questions answered or anything. I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Email.
Yeah. That's fantastic, and we will be in touch.
Cool.
All right.
All
Take
right.
care, Barry.
We're having a big snowstorm blowing today, so
Oh yeah, I heard.
it looks very exciting. We'll see. It's still trying. It's just barely doing anything right now, so we're still safe.
Okay, good.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.